At Energy Media, we have argued editorially that the oil and gas industry has to be prepared for a faster than expected energy transition as it accelerates in the 2020s. Wood Mackenzie, the international consultancy, has prepared a report about an alternate scenario, energy transition scenario, if global governments are serious about keeping global warming to 2 degrees C. So we're going to speak to the author of that study, Ann-Louise Hittle, who is head of macro oil. So welcome to the interview, Ann-Louise.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Now, this is really a fascinating look into what could happen. It's just one scenario, but maybe we'll start with, could you give us an overview of that scenario, please?
Sure. So, as you said, the energy transition, it's interesting. In the last year, it's become even more prominent in government actions and in the media and also for the industry. So, we decided that we've got to do something where let's just assume that the world succeeds in meeting the 2 degree, no more than a 2 degree increase in temperatures by 2050. And assuming that the world does that, what does it take? So in effect, we reverse engineered it, which we wanted to show for the industry what could happen, what is needed, what are possible policies that could occur to drive this to happen. So that was the opening presumption of the scenario. We then went on and said, let's look at the different forms of energy and think about how this is going to happen. And there are a couple important conclusions that we offer in this scenario. Now, this is just a scenario. It's one of other ways that the goal could be reached of 2 degrees increase. However, we're going to posit this as the Wood Mackenzie case in effect. And we call it the alternative energy transition scenario. And for short, we call it the AET2. So at some point, if I refer to it as AET2, that's what I'm referring to in our conversation. And we made an assumption, or we looked at the requirements, and it's very clear the world needs to become much more electrified and rely on different forms of energy, such as renewables, to create the electricity. And that will help move us out of a hydrocarbon world. And to get to that, we looked at the different forms of energy, and what we saw, looking at oil, very specifically, is that we would need to jumpstart the increase of EVs in the world global fleet of passenger vehicles. And on that basis, we then reached our conclusion for oil. We did the same thing for gas. We did the same thing for other sources of energy. My focus and our focus today is on what does it mean for gas and oil, and in particular, in my case, oil, and the overall transport fleet globally.
Right. So my takeaway from your analysis, Ann-Louise, is that the world will electrify more quickly than we expect under your AET2 scenario. There will be more reliance on low carbon fuels like hydrogen or biofuels, and a big emphasis on carbon capture, sequestration, and utilization. And what are the likelihoods of those technologies taking off faster than we expect at this moment?
In other words, what is the likelihood that they're able to play this role in this scenario? For some of them, it's more likely than others. In the case of hydrogen, we think that that's fairly likely now, given the impetus that's occurred. Carbon sequestration seems to be picking up as an area of interest for the industry. There's a lot of technological research going into that. So we do think that'll be a core part of how we reduce emissions. In fact, it helps drive us to that goal, and it actually reduces, obviously, energy demand by 2050 by a significant amount. So carbon sequestration, hydrogen are two core ones. Biofuels is a little bit more difficult, but it is part of jet fuel and getting the world's reliance off of jet fuel to go in the direction of biofuels.
Right. I want to get your response to something that I've observed, and that is, as the technology improves, and let's take electric vehicles as an example, battery technology is way ahead of where we thought it was going to be just a few years ago. I mean, these are, experts that I interview all the time, and everybody was surprised how much they've come down in price and how much they've gone up in energy density and what that's doing to the automotive industry. So here's my question for you. If technology continues to improve faster than expected, does that embolden governments to up their climate ambitions? Because now it becomes easier to achieve more, tougher goals for the same money or less money.
True, it does. And it is one of the reasons why we at Wood Mackenzie, in our base case, have become much more aggressive on EV penetration into the global transport fleet. That's a key part of it. But on this scenario and the likelihood that governments become more aggressive, yes, as well as car manufacturers, such as General Motors that made the announcement they did, that they have an aspiration to go fully EV in terms of what they sell by 2035 to 2040. So it opens up doors. But there will be other areas of resistance that have to be overcome as well, besides the technology one and what happens to batteries.
Right. And one of those, of course, is greening up the grid. And now in Canada, we have a fairly green grid already. It's 80% of it is either hydro or low carbon, like nuclear. But in the US, I think it's still around the low 30s percentage for coal. So I assume that replacing coal in power generation plays a big part in your scenario.
It does, and I'm glad you brought that up actually, because that's why gas is a part of our scenario. In fact, what happens is in our scenario, which I think is interesting for the industry, is that gas demand ends up significantly better off than oil demand. So I'm going to give you some numbers for oil, because in the case of oil, by 2050, oil demand is 70 million barrels a day lower than where it is now, or will be by 2022, let's say. So it's a 35 to 30 million barrels a day. That's a huge drop in demand. It's being driven by that electrification. What happens with gas demand, though, is that it's actually flat to growing. And the reason for that is it's part of the transition out of coal. And because gas can also be linked to hydrogen, what we see in LNG, we still see use of gas at a more stable to rising outlook in this scenario, which I think is interesting. And then the title of the study that we put out is called Reversal of Fortune. And that's referring to the fact that in this scenario, right now, gas prices are always traditionally and currently are weaker than oil. But in this scenario, what happens is by 2050, it's the opposite. Gas prices are a little bit stronger, significantly stronger than oil prices. And that's part of this push to get off of coal.
Now, I've interviewed experts who talked about how the energy transition will be asymmetrical. So it's going to be more rapid in North America, Europe, and China, Japan, South Korea, the more of the developed economies, and it'll be slower in places in continents like Africa and Latin America and other places. What are the chances in your accelerated scenario that governments in places like Brazil, for instance, or Argentina, or any of those, say, less developed economies, also decide to implement stricter policy and speed up the energy transition? What role did that play, if any?
Well, because we're trying to make sure that we achieve the 2-degree world, in effect, and this is a heroic assumption, we assumed that there was a regulatory effort on the part of countries such as Brazil, or even in the case of, let's say, India, countries that might not necessarily have this be front of center, to electrify their transport fleet as well as build out their electric grid more fully. So that's how we skirt the issue, but that helps us achieve our goal of a 2-degree world. But the fact is that could end up being a lagging, as you said, asymmetrical outcome. The other point to make is that a lot of this is going to come down to cost, which governments are going to be willing to impose these regulations and take on the cost, either themselves or through the consumers. And indirectly, it will end up being the consumer. So there's a lot of different variables, but for the purposes of this study, we assume that we were able to get around those obstacles and that there's sort of this global effort. Now, the greatest downside is occurring in the biggest consumers, as you mentioned. I mean, they have the most to lose, in effect, in terms of their oil demand. So US, China, Europe, and Japan. Those are the countries where we see the most reduction in demand.
Now, I imagine that you were working on this prior to the election of Joe Biden and the introduction of his ambitious climate plan. Would his plan be be in line with your accelerated scenario?
It would be, and it could be, except for the fact that it has to be implemented for longer than 4 years. So to achieve the accelerated scenario, we'd have to see the U.S. continue to commit to this kind of a program. So there's the risk. But on the other hand, within his 4 years, President Biden's administration can and is implementing plans to implement changes that will help accelerate the adoption of EVs, for example, in the US. And when we do our base case now, we've actually increased our EV outlook in the United States because of President Biden's administration and changes that he's making. Now, the biggest driver in our base case is technology. And as you said, the reduction in battery costs and this sort of thing. That's the biggest driver in our base case. Whereas in the scenario, it's more technology, of course, but also that regulatory push that has to occur.
Now, this will be the last question, Ann-Louise, and it's more of a sort of your take on things. But we talk a lot about policy, tougher policy, you know, almost like it's a penalty on economies to lower their GHG emissions. But something that President Biden said in his campaign literature around the energy transition, climate change, and his approach since he's taken power has stuck with me. And that is, he sees this as clean energy and clean technology as the new industrial revolution. And he is determined, he thinks that the US has fallen behind China, and he's determined, he said, by 2030 to put it back in the driver's seat, to make America #1 in these, you know, in these new energy technologies. And that suggests that even in countries like India or Brazil or so on are going to be investing in those industries, electrifying and switching over to EVs and so on, not because they're penalizing their economies, because that's the direction. If they want to be developed, that's where they have to invest, and that's what they have to encourage. And that puts it in a bit of a different light, I think. What's your take on that?
No, I agree with you completely. And we have electrification occurring in our base case, even in India or Brazil. That's absolutely the case for the reasons that you're talking about. It doesn't have to be a penalty. It can be a benefit. And it also could, for example, in the case of the US, enable it to compete globally on trade, for example, in these areas. But my point was that in terms of the regulatory aspect, which doesn't have to be a penalty, but in order to drive, and this is what can be a little bit disappointing for those of us who want to see carbon emissions fall, in order to accelerate it and make this happen by 2050 is where you almost have to up the game a bit and get a regulatory push, at least in the way we did the analysis. Now, could it happen a different way? Absolutely, with the technological breakthroughs that accelerate the process. But at this point, on the basis of what we looked at, we realized that you needed to have a regulatory push as well in order to help accelerate the change.
Ann-Louise, thank you very much for this very interesting study and fascinating insights.
Great. It's great to talk to you. Take care.